We're going to talk now about Thomas Aquinas's demonstrations for the existence of God. This is probably what Thomas Aquinas is most well known for, what are called sometimes the five proofs for the existence of God. Thomas Aquinas himself probably wouldn't have been thrilled by that. The proofs are pretty short. He works them out in much more detail in other places. His point, though, was that it is rational to believe in a God. And so I want to walk through one of the proofs that you watched, the proof from motion, and talk a little bit both about the proof itself and then what it says about how Aquinas understood God. So when he said the word God, what was Aquinas talking about? Okay, so the argument from motion. Here's how this works. And again, if you haven't watched the Bishop Barron video, I recommend that you do. It's about 10 minutes and he lays this out helpfully. So this is a repeat because it is a little bit tough. All right, so the argument from motion might better be thought of for us as an argument from change. Remember that for Aquinas, the word he's working with is motus, which is change. So this isn't just about like local motion or people who move, but anything that changes. And a key idea here, according to Aquinas, is that there's potency and there is act. And everything moves from potency, a potential to be something else, to an act, or everything that moves from potency to act. So what Thomas Aquinas says is this: everything that changes is changed by something external to it, or nothing that moves itself in the same way. So in other words, if something undergoes change, that part that is undergoing change can't be changed by itself. It has to be changed by something external to it. So the example here that Bishop Barron used was, say, somebody learning a language, right? If I'm going from someone who doesn't know French to someone who does know French, I don't spontaneously have French in my head. That would be nice and would make learning languages much easier, but it's not how it works. I am changed by things external. Teachers, books, picking up the language from conversation. However that happens, the change happens by things external moving me from the potential to know French to knowing French. And for Aquinas, that's true of all change. Now, I want to note something here in what Aquinas says. Everything that changes is changed by something external, or everything that moves. Some of the what we call new atheists, people who are kind of evangelistic in their atheism. One of these that comes to mind is Richard Dawkins. Says that this argument falls apart because Aquinas says that everything changes, thus God would change, thus his argument falls apart. That's not what Aquinas says. Aquinas doesn't make the claim that everything changes. He makes the claim that everything that changes is changed by something external to itself. Little note here, I have no problem with atheism. There are very smart atheists in the world. There are people who are atheists for all sort of philosophical and moral reasons. Richard Dawkins doesn't understand Thomas Aquinas, and that's a different thing, right? He just isn't reading him carefully. All right, so everything that changes is changed by something external to it. Okay? Another way of saying that is only something actual can move something potential. So only something in possession of French can move something that doesn't have possession of French to having French. You have to have something that is actual in that sense to move something that is only potential, right? So a fire, which is warm, is the actual warmth that moves, say, a log, which is potentially warm, to warmth. Okay? Good so far? Okay. Now, for Thomas, what you can't have is infinite regress. You can't then trace back motion just forever and have something acting on something that's acting on something. At some point, according to Thomas, you have to get to some first element, an unmoved mover, an unactualized actualizer, something that is just pure act, that doesn't need anything acting on it to change it, but is simply all act. all, I can't think of a better word, act, no potentiality. And that for Thomas is God, pure act. There for Thomas, God isn't potentially anything, God is simply pure act. And you need that pure act in order to have any movement anywhere in the world. I want to make here a distinction that's important because there are two ways of understanding that first act. And one is not what Thomas Aquinas is talking about when he talks about God. This is the, the sense of something that starts. So the idea here is that there is a first mover that is a mover per accident, or is a first mover in the way that the first domino that you push down, that then pushes down all the other dominoes, is the first mover. It's the first mover in time. In this scenario, once that first domino has been pushed and all the other dominoes start going, you could lift up that first domino and throw it away, and the succession would keep going, right? Once that first domino hits the second domino, you don't need that first domino anymore to keep things moving. Its job is done. That is not how Thomas Aquinas sees God. That's the idea, right? The God as domino is that God just starts everything in motion and then like goes on a vacation for eternity. That's not Thomas Aquinas's God. God isn't just starting things in time and then they go forward and God's like, oh, I'm going to do my nails. Okay, not what's happening for Thomas Aquinas. Part of what that means, and this is a little parenthetical, is that when Thomas Aquinas makes the argument from motion for the existence of God, Thomas doesn't necessarily think he's making an argument for a creation that has a beginning. Thomas Aquinas doesn't think that the argument from motion proves that creation started at some point in time. He thinks that that's a matter of faith or a matter of doctrine. He doesn't think that the argument of motion gets there. He thinks the argument from motion proves the existence of a God, but he's not prepared to say that it proves that then creation isn't eternal. That, again, for Thomas Aquinas is a matter of faith. There are people in other religious traditions who have a similar argument from motion, who actually might see creation as co-eternal with God, although still dependent on God. Thomas Aquinas recognizes that this argument is a logical argument that can get you to the existence of a God, but it can't prove then all of Christian doctrine. That was parenthetical. If I lost you, just ignore it. What Thomas Aquinas is arguing about God is that this is a per se succession, meaning that for Thomas Aquinas, God has to underwrite all movement in the universe at every moment. Let me say that again. For Thomas Aquinas, God underlies or underwrites or makes possible every change in the universe at every moment. So here we have a chart, right? And we can, if we start with me, right? I move. That's because the world around me is enabling to move. There's oxygen and the planets are turning and there's heat and all of those things that enable my movement, move me from potency to act, are happening. And if for Thomas Aquinas, if you go down far enough, what you hit is the God whose pure act, who at every moment is enabling all that action. So again, Thomas Aquinas isn't talking about a domino God. I begin things and they just go and God's like, fine. God, Thomas Aquinas is talking about an unmoved mover who at every millisecond is what underlies change, what underlies movement. If for a moment, like hypothetically, God stopped actualizing, everything would just go poof, it would just disappear. Okay? So God enables everything that happens moment to moment for Aquinas. So again, he's not talking about just a God who sets things in motion at the beginning, but a God whose existence is necessary to explain any movement anywhere in the universe at any second. That, for Thomas Aquinas, is what he means when he talks about God. So, what do we then say about Aquinas on God? Well, first of all, Thomas Aquinas here is not particularly unique. He's very clear and he lays it all out systematically. But he's part of a larger tradition, which sometimes is called classical theism, a classical understanding of God, that actually is not necessarily unique to Christianity. Now, doctrines like the Trinity are, but what Thomas Aquinas here is doing isn't the doctrine of the Trinity. It's just simply a belief in God, that you can find people making similar cases in Judaism, in Islam, in various forms of Hinduism, in Neoplatonism. So this is not simply Thomas Aquinas, but again, he lays it all out very systematically. For Thomas Aquinas, God is the unmoved mover or the unactualized actualizer, and we can figure out that there must be a God using our reason. You can't figure out the Trinity using your reason. That comes through revelation, through Scripture. But Thomas Aquinas says you can deduce from the world around you, the fact that there is movement, that there is change, that there must be a God. That just philosophically makes sense. Can you prove it empirically? Well, no, because empiricism involves created things in a lab, but you can deduce it philosophically. That's what Aquinas is doing. Implications then. So who is this God that Aquinas is describing? Well, this God is simple. That might seem strange. That's not always a term of endearment. But what Aquinas means here is that in God, existence and essence are the same. Meaning what makes God God and that God exists are the same. Take the contrast there, let's see, is anything else in the universe, right? I had a dog named Skeeters growing up, right? So let's think of Skeeters. She's a little cockapoo. She was very cute, liked to cuddle. Didn't like me so much, but really liked my mom. That's another story we don't have to get into. The essence of Skeeters, right, is different than Skeeters' existence. I can still think about Skeeters and who Skeeters was and what Skeeters looked like and describe Skeeters, but she doesn't exist anymore. Right? Her essence and her existence are separate. In God, according to Aquinas in this tradition, existence and essence are the same thing. Another way of saying that is that God is existence as such. God is the ground of existence. God is the very notion of being or being itself. So God isn't a being. Skeeters was a being. I am a being. You are a being. For Thomas Aquinas, God is being itself, the very fact of existing itself. God is that which exists on its own, of its own power. Its existence, God's existence doesn't come from outside God. God contains God's existence in God's self. 2, impassibility. This is the belief that nothing outside of God can affect God. That might sound abstract, but let me put it in different terms. This is the belief that God can't go from potency to act, meaning God can't change, right? If God changes, that means there was something in God that was potent. And Thomas Aquinas says, no, God is pure act. Pure act. There's no change in God. Now, a lot of people, particularly today, don't like this way of understanding God because it means that things like God in God's self doesn't suffer. And a lot of times today in theology, people actually want to be able to say, like, God suffers with us. or God gets angry at evil or sin. Thomas Aquinas would, and people who follow him would say that that's how it looks to us, that when God's pure act meets sin or evil or sadness, it comforts, it appears as wrath. But that's only from our side. Nothing is actually changing from God's side, because God is just the same pure act all the time, the same pure act of being, the same pure act of love, the same pure act of truth. How that pure act feels in different circumstances to us may differ, but God does not differ in God's self, because God is always the same pure act of love. Then we have an echo here of Rowan Williams, who would agree with Thomas Aquinas pretty much on everything I've said so far. He's in this classical theist tradition, which means that for Thomas Aquinas, the divine and the human relationship is not competitive. You can't be competitive for Thomas Aquinas with that which gives you existence. Again, it's sort of like being competitive with air, or it would be like a lamp being competitive with electricity. Humans and God just don't occupy the same plane for Thomas Aquinas, right? So God is always giving us existence, always giving us being, always giving us just everything that we are. We can't be competitive with that. And here again, competitive means it's not that if God is taking up space, that leaves less space for us. Thomas Aquinas' God, and the God of classical theism, gives us being itself. So God isn't taking up space that we would like to have. God enables us to have any space at all. What that means, and we'll talk more about this later, and Rowan Williams talked about it too, is the sense that we don't become less when God becomes more. So you don't become less yourself if you say are more filled with God, because it's not a competitive relationship. Being filled with more being, right, is not making you less who you are, it's making you more who you are. That is the argument for motion and some of the implications of it. Next set of slides, we're going to look at Thomas Aquinas on sin and nature and grace, or if you want to think about it this way, on the human problem and on right relationship.